Well, hello once again and welcome to this webinar from Glass IG. And today we're going to be discussing the challenges of information governance. My name is John Gard and I am the Product Marketing Manager for Glass IG. And before we start, I'll just run you through the agenda and what we're going to talk about today. Firstly, we'll cover some introductions. And then we'll talk about the purpose of this webinar, which is based on a series of blogs that have been posted on our website called The Challenges of Information Governance. And then we're going to delve down into some of the questions that the first blog post raises, learning lessons from the past, what is successful information governance, and some of the key lessons that we've learned. And then if we have time, I hope we'll be able to answer some of the questions. So please use the chat facilities on the call to raise questions as we go along, and we'll attempt to answer some of those at the end. Okay, so just to introduce the webinar, before we introduce the panelists that we have here today, I just wanted to introduce something else, another entity, and that is Glass IG itself. You may or may not have heard much about Glass IG, but we are an information governance provider. We provide a solution to information governance called Glass, and this solution is actually older than the company itself. So the company Glass IG was only formed this year, but the solution that we provide, Glass, was actually formerly RSD Glass, and we've been in the market for quite a long time. So we have a lot of experience and expertise within our company. But our former parent company decided that it would split into two divisions and then into two companies to focus on different aspects. And the Glass IG side, or the new Glass IG company, is very focused on information governance and only information governance, which is great for us. It gives us a startup mentality in a company which has also got the depth and the experience and is a solution provider in this space. So these are exciting times, and we look forward to an amazing year ahead and new products and very interesting things that will be coming your way in the near future. So that's who we are, Glass IG. And now I want to say to you that if you want to find out more about us, then you can look at our newsletter. And if you haven't received our newsletter, then please get in touch and we'll send it to you. Our first newsletter went out a couple of weeks ago, our spring newsletter. And the reason I bring that up is that it has a very interesting interview within that newsletter with James Figger, our CEO, talking about how Glass IG came to be and his role in the company. So if you're interested in delving down into that a little bit further, then please look at that newsletter and at that particular article within the newsletter. All right, so who else have I got with me today? I've got James Amser, our Global Sales Manager, and I've got Tim Snell. And what I'll do now, James, I can see that you're on the webinar. I'll get you to perhaps introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your role in the organization.
Thank you, John. Good morning to everyone who's joined us, and good afternoon, and in a couple cases, good evening to you. So I joined RSD back at the end of 2010, just as Glass had hit the market. And at the time, I was in a pre-sales role and eventually came to run the pre-sales team. So what that means for those of you on the call today is we were in charge of making sure that Glass worked, and that is fit customer requirements and made sure it addressed the specific challenges that caused them to call us in the first place. So I look forward to sharing some of those war stories today. So right now, as it says up on there, I run the sales team for our new entity, Glass IG, and I'm pleased to be invited to participate today.
Excellent, thanks, James. And I'm sitting here actually right next to Tim Snell, and our second panelist. So Tim, perhaps you could say a few words.
Hi, thanks, John. Yeah, I joined RSD as it was then, a little after James, but in the new organization, I really have two main roles, one of which is something of an account management role, which is really working with our existing customers, mostly in the UK, but also in some other English-speaking territories that aren't North America. And in those cases, it's really making sure that customers' information governance programs are proceeding as they would wish, and that we can help them and give our experience and know how to help ease those things along. And also that our product is meeting their needs, and maybe sometimes getting some feedback from the field and taking it back inside to our product management team. And as well as that, I'm also involved in something which is not really a sales role as such, but onboarding new customers, which really comes back to what James said, which is really the mapping of the customer requirements to the solution that we have and making sure there's a good fit and synergy there. So that's me.
Fantastic. And of course, Glass IG, we're based all over the world, but our main markets are in North America, where James is, and in Europe, and in the UK, where Tim and myself are based. Okay, so where did this idea of having this webinar series come from? It came from a series of blog posts that were posted onto our website earlier in the year by our VP Marketing, Francois Chazalon, and he created some blog posts that were very interesting and have raised a lot of interest with us. And if you want to read those blog posts that prompted these webinars, then just go to our website and you'll see 4 buttons there at the top of the website: See, Demo, Try, and Learn. And if you click on Learn, then that gives you quick access specifically to these blog posts that we're highlighting. But really the basis of these blog posts were, I would call it a past, present, and future look at information governance. And so in the first blog post, Francois talked about what have we learned so far from this information governance adventure that we've been on for the last few years. And then in the second blog post, he looked at what was the daily reality, what is happening in the present in organizations and at the workplace where people are challenged by information governance issues and how are they handling them. And then the third blog post was really a future look at information governance. What are the technologies that are coming along that are exciting? What are the ways that people are adapting and changing in the world around them in terms of, for example, the roles and responsibilities within organizations, and how will we see information governance in the future? And a lot of what he was talking about was this idea of information governance is really just emerging as a discipline. It's quite in its infancy, it's young. So we thought that in addition to just posting those blog posts with the interest that we received, we would also then talk about them and perhaps have a webinar series where we did a similar thing. And this is the first of these webinars, and we're going to look at what we've learned from information governance so far. How have we got to where we are at? And this is really based on that first blog post. So let me summarize the things that Francois wrote about in the first blog post. He talked about really what were the objectives of information governance, and he phrased them as minimizing risk and cost, and then optimizing the value of our information. And he talked about how far we have come in terms of which things we do well and which things we don't do quite so well of those objectives. And then he moved on and talked about how information governance was often seen as a sort of a short-term initiative, as a project that we would have within an organization to try and transform it to information governance, perhaps put a solution into an organization, that sort of thing. And that was run as a project rather than as a long-term initiative where we know each year we have to keep revising what we're doing, we have to maintain it, and we have to extend it to other parts of the business. And then he talked about who is actually driving the information governance program, and that's another question that we're going to try and look at while during this webinar. Who's in charge, where does our budget come from, and those sorts of things. And then, of course, there's the issue of where is the value in information governance. If we can't define a value in our information and in our information governance strategy, if we can't see that our program is succeeding, then people won't be interested in investing time or money into it. So it's not going to get the love and attention that it requires in order to be successful. And part of that is this question of, is the the message of information governance too complex? Is it because information governance is sometimes seen as a cobbling together of different technologies such as file analysis and e-discovery and these sorts of technologies, or is there a coherent message that we need to get out of information governance? And so that was really the basis of that first blog post in summary. And I'm going to now ask James, in the first instance, if you've got anything to add to that in terms of what you see as being some of these issues that perhaps we should be talking about today.
In each case, yes, and so I'll focus on the last two, where we get to the value question. As we wrap up kind of in the second half of our hour, we'll return to that question, because I do want to hit upon some of the benefits and kind of key, I guess, key performance indicators that sort of answer that question. So I'm going to come back to the value question before we're done. I want to instead take a look at the complexity of the message and say that historically, yes, we've struggled with that, and especially early in the 2010, when I first joined, and maybe the next 18, 24 months after that, the information governance space was still very much kind of defining itself, and we in the vendor community were struggling against each other to push IG towards, is it data quality, is it email management, is it just the next version of records management, and so in those cases, some of us said yes to all those questions, and so therefore the specificity of the information governance message was lost, and so it ended up becoming kind of a Rorschach test, where a vendor, you could learn what a vendor does well by seeing how they defined information governance. So I think we're better about that now, and in particular, kind of honing in on the benefits of IG in a role-specific way, that for legal, you've got one set of benefits, for IT another, for the records manager, for the end users in particular. Those were sort of lost at the beginning as we were having that fight I discussed earlier. The end users were lost in that conversation, and so I believe we're better about that now, and in fact, we even lead in our projects over the last maybe 18 months or so. We lead with conversations with the end users to find out how it is that they create and access information, and then translate the project into terms that are relevant for them.
Fantastic. Thanks, James. And Tim, do you see something similar in the markets that you look at? Have users struggled to sort of understand what information governance is, and perhaps it's a bit confusing in terms of an older discipline called records management that people have been used to?
Yeah, that's probably the first thing, and the most obvious thing that would come to me is that I think as an industry, people who worked on this side of the fence within, let's say, the records management, the information management side, were initially guilty of thinking that the information governance really was just a rebranding and a rename of records management. But not everyone thought that. And there were some parties who perhaps took more of a general corporate governance view, or perhaps took an information security view on things. And then there were other people who came from perhaps more of the pure information side, but saying, hey, let's extend this out to a broader scope than just records. So why don't we include all information? So start to include non-record sources of corporate information in things like email or in shared drives, which would not have been considered to be formal declared records within the EDRMS system, but nonetheless contain a great deal of business value, but also needed to be managed, as Francois said, to minimize risk and so on. So really, the one thing I think that has helped is there has been a convergence as people have realized that it's not helpful to have many definitions which conflict and contradict for information governance. And I think now we're starting to see that people are talking with a common understanding of what information governance is, and hopefully the vocabulary, which is probably always shared, but when people say the same words and terms, they're starting to mean at least the same things. So I've seen some feedback coming in on the Q&A, which I'm also trying to monitor in the background, so thanks for that. And there was a question saying, could we provide a list of the disciplines that we would have considered to be part of information governance. And certainly I would include the classic information management, the records management, and also there will be elements from really a horizontal slice across the business of people who are responsible in some way for managing any of the aspects of business that would really affect the risk, cost and value. So it is difficult sometimes because there are aspects of security involved, there are aspects of managing storage and so on. And that's why, and I think as we go through this webinar, hopefully we really start to expand on that and show people who the key people are, which key departments are, and how information governance should and can sit, and does sit within some of our customers as a program, who's responsible, where the benefits are felt.
Excellent, thanks Tim, and I think that's a really interesting question, and let's return to that in a moment. And there's another question in there as well, which is what do we define as the information that we're actually governing, and the difference between, for example, information and data and those sorts of questions as well. So let's come back to that idea of what are the disciplines involved in IG after we just delve into a little section for a while, and this is, I think, is important one just to put in at this point, because we're talking about how we see what we've done in the past and how we use that to learn and to move forward and to evaluate our successes and failures in the space. And I think it's really quite important that we look at these things in terms of how do we build an information governance program that gives us the opportunities to actually get the feedback from what we're doing. So how do we monitor the effectiveness of the program that we're doing, and should we be doing that at the beginning when we're setting up our information governance program, rather than afterwards trying to piece together what happened when we look back on it retrospectively? And so is this something that's really useful to put in from the very beginning, and what are the benefits that we could realize from that? So Tim, perhaps if I start with you this time, and really, have you seen programs which didn't benefit from being able to understand what the success factors were, and programs that have benefited from that?
Yeah, I think that's key, isn't it? If you don't have some clear objectives, and I think also within information governance some quick wins, because one of the things that I think was pointed out in Francois' blog post was that information governance is not a one-off project that will deliver something and then a project team is stood down and walks away. It's very much more along the lines of I don't know, the things that are ongoing within an organisation. So health and safety, or quality, or things that people sometimes will view as perhaps being a necessary evil, but things that can have a real benefit, and not just when they save us from a fine. But there are many examples when we can think of how information exploitation can actually really add bottom line value. So not just avoid the negative and the bad things in life. So what I would say is that is understanding maybe where there are some quick wins is something that I found would be really important in making sure the information governance program stays on track. And in terms of when we're talking about the effectiveness and the reviewing, it's really understanding that one of the things I've seen is that we have, and we often talk about 80-20 rules. And within information governance, I think you often come across very clear examples of that. So, whether it's 80% of the information that we're storing, and 20%, and how much of it is junk and how much is useful, or perhaps a disproportionate amount of time we spend managing certain things like this. So, I find it quite useful to try and take an approach to that and really focus in on. Let's find some high-value content. Let's find some quick wins. Let's find whether it's what we can dispose of or which items we should be focusing in on first, and really using this to be able to sort of phase a program rollout in an appropriate way. That actually lets us do things incrementally, because otherwise, for many of the organisations who are represented by some of the people on this webinar, the scale of the information that they have that's sitting around in their in their shared drives, in their email systems, in their collaboration and content management platforms is truly enormous, and they cannot realistically think, well, we'll start to try and set some information governance things up in the background, we'll get a program running, and then we'll move in a very short space of time from having nothing governed to having everything governed, and suddenly finding all the benefits. It's far more useful to consider. Let's look at one department, or perhaps one legacy system or one area where we know there's some really, really beneficial or valuable stuff in there. Let's try and get that under governance. Let's learn some lessons. Let's see what works well in our organization. And then from that, to try and work out what those performance indicators are, because they really do vary from business to business. There is not a one-size-fits-all. So, you know, I'm very much an advocate of starting small, making sure you do start, and then iteratively repeating similar processes and making these little improvements or adjustments as you go along, depending on, you know, the nature of the next slice of content or department or jurisdiction that you'll be tackling.
And is that your experience too, James? Do you think that it's important to start small, to make sure that you're measuring the right things, to do some steps as you go along, to make sure that you're reviewing what you've done so far and whether that's been successful or not, and adjusting course? So it's a little bit like steering a large boat. You do it in little increments. You don't sort of swing the rudder one way and then the other. Is that your experience as well, James?
I would agree with that. Ironically, I'm not sure I would have 4 years ago, and here's what I mean by that. So our initial view of information governance, and certainly this was the case throughout most of the vendor community, was very much a technology-driven one. And so as I'm looking back on our project plans that we executed on back in those days, they were highly system-focused and technology-focused. So you know, get the various components of the system operational, connect with the directory services like LDAP so we know who has access to what, make sure that the repository connectors are in place to the 3 or 4 or 5 different content systems that are being managed, execute a couple of tests, and woo, celebrate. So and in that view, it was very much of a big picture type thing. Let's make sure that all the content can be governed, but do so only from a technology specific aspect. And then once you've done that, then you sort of say, okay, our work is done here. Well, that approach failed and is failing right now. We're seeing some of our competitors who are learning this lesson the hard way in much the same way we did. So to counteract that, it's very much of a let's take a look at the various organizations and decide who's ready to prove out these capabilities, who's hurting word, you know, whose hair is on fire, if you will, and therefore is most in need of this, and let's prove this out very small and specifically, and then trumpet the successes throughout the organization. And because success breeds further success, you end up generating some momentum, and so you see, okay, well, we did this for our friends over in health and safety. Now the HR folks are asking for this, or perhaps on a system-by-system basis that we managed to put some subset of SharePoint content under governance, and now having done so, let's extend that out into shared drives or perhaps a cloud-based system or another sort of semi-structured repository. And then you iterate that. The notion that an information governance professional may never finish the project was frightening some time ago, but now it's actually quite invigorating in the sense that there's always something to improve and always something else to be placed under governance to the betterment of your organization.
Now, I've noticed on the chat we've got another question about the ownership, and we will move on to the ownership of information governance, but it really is interesting that this multidisciplinary thread is coming up in the conversation today. And just on the bottom of this slide, I've noted some of the things that I've seen that are really important in information governance within an organization in terms of success factors. So it's not just about technology, it's about things like making sure that you get your information policies right, that you get information policies that are at the right level for your organization. It's about planning the processes and how they're going to engage with information governance. So information governance shouldn't be an add-on after you've built your business or planned all your processes and it's just something that you do at the end to meet a regulatory requirement. It should be at the heart of the things that you do. And education as well is a really important thing, that we are ensuring that we're teaching people and we're changing our culture with information governance so that we become an organization that is proud of its information governance. We're the organization that manages its information well and uses its information and exploits it in terms of our business, and that becomes a part of the psyche of people, of the culture of people, that they're actually doing information governance, and it's a part of their work ethic that they're really proud of. That is something that really contributes to the business because the information is good. We can rely on it within our organization, and we can be trusted with our customers and our stakeholders. So it's very interesting to see this multidisciplinary thread emerging. And another question in the chat about who owns information governance. I promise we will come on to this question in just a moment. So how do we define successful information governance? What is it that we should be looking at in order to see a successful program? And I mentioned that Francois picked out risk and cost and value as important factors of the objectives of information governance. That is, of course, ensuring that we're not exposing ourselves to compliance and other risks such as security, making sure that we are getting value for money, that we're not overindulging on our information governance, but that we're paying an appropriate amount for the value that we get back from it. And of course, optimizing the value. And it's often said that well-organized information that we can access, that we can reuse, that we know where it is, and that we know that it's reliable and authentic, can be incredibly valuable to an organization. And in fact, we see organizations in the world today that are based almost entirely, the value of the business, on the information that they hold. And this includes even big players such as Facebook and Google. It is the information that they have that makes them such valuable properties in terms of a business sense. But that's not just true of those sorts of businesses, it's true of traditional businesses as well. It influences all aspects of the business. So, James, I'm going to ask you if you've got some comments about what do you see is really successful information governance, and how would you define information governance in this respect?
Yeah, this was what I was this was the can I was kicking down the road just a moment ago, and I'm pleased to return to it. So, in the background, I was looking for a paper that Barclay Blair had written maybe 2 years ago, and I couldn't quite find it. But some of you on the call will know off the top of your head what I'm talking about. He represents an organization called the Information Governance Initiative. He's one of the founders of it. We in our RSD days were a charter sponsor of it, and one of the papers that he wrote early had to do with the 10 benefits of information governance, and so what we have seen, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, is that our successful projects map to a handful of those. Certainly not all 10, but even before the project has gotten underway, they've identified 3 or 4 items, be it cost of e-discovery or storage or metrics related to risk or compliance, and said, this is the reason why we're doing this. And our services team has even been able to put some quantifiable numbers against those. And so our successful projects take 3, 4, maybe even 5 of them and say, we're going to focus on these, and we're going to write our use cases in alignment with these, and we'll even write some dashboards that are very specific to measuring the success against those metrics. And so the project kicks off with an estimated benefit, and then away we go into the project and measure how we do so, and then compare the results of the initial pilot exercise, the starting small that we were talking about a moment ago. Compare the actual results with those that were forecast, and then make some decisions based on that, and then extrapolate what would happen if we extended the project through other areas in the organization. That's the green spot approach that Tim alluded to a moment ago, that having established some success here, let's roll with it there. And so specifics could include the the volume of content by document and or record being placed under a specific policy. What percentage of those have already been over-retained that we can get rid of? And then make some e-discovery cost extrapolations based on, okay, having reduced volume by, let's say, 30%, then corresponding costs, should a major litigation come through, would also be affected by a commensurate percent. So, so the answer to the very bottom bullet point there, how do we measure progress towards our information governance goals, first depends on identifying those. And we advocate picking and choosing from amongst those 10. And then, as necessary, tracking those via dashboard that are very specific to those measurables and to, I was going to say gatekeepers, that's not the right word, the stakeholders that are sponsoring the program that are most interested in it.
You raised a really interesting question there, James, and that is around how do we measure the value of these things. And in information governance, there are some tangible things, aren't there, Tim? But there are also lots of intangible things, and maybe in different disciplines that are associated, talking about the multidisciplinary approach, in different disciplines that are associated with information governance, the tangible things are more important or less important. So if I was having a conversation with finance, for example, around my budget, they would want some tangible evidence. Or if I was talking to IT, they'd be talking about the storage costs, they'd be talking about the number of transactions or documents that we were governing, these sorts of things. But for some of the people involved in information governance, there's more of an intangible benefit and value as well, isn't there? Have you seen this in your experience?
Yes, and in both in the current guise in information governance and previously working a lot with content management platforms, where there is a perennial issue about how do you prove the return and investment. And many approaches have been tried. I know you're aware of some of this yourself, John, but typically once you get past the immediately quantifiable things such as, you said, storage reduction, people can start to look at other sort of predicted cost reductions, and it's less of a thing in the UK, I know, but for the people in North America who'll be very aware of the cost of legal discovery, which is normally charged against some sort of metric based on either number of pages, number of boxes, number of gigabytes or terabytes, and those costs can get huge. So simply not having those, you have lowered the risk, and that is something that is measurable in terms of the size of risk that you're managing. So I think that is a really important one. The other thing is of course, we're talking about information exploitation, and to put it simply, and how we would have referred to it 10 years ago in the content management world, if we can help people get hold of the right piece of information more quickly, and then it follows all of the business processes that somehow involve working from or working with that information, will be either more efficient or more accurate, and there'll be less need for rework and all those sorts of things. For me, it's best reflected not in some kind of hard way that you're measuring like that, but culturally, I think you move from being an information unaware business to being information aware. And the big difference is we often see people, and I'm sure there are people on the line right now who will be sitting in a situation thinking, I just don't even know what I've got, what's out there. I may have a vague idea of where we've got some stuff, and I know there are some some doors with dragons behind them, probably in content terms, but I'm really not sure. And going back and seeing those guys 18 months later, when they put some things in place, sometimes relatively simple, starting with some basic audit around what's available in the information estate, and they tend to then have much less of an attitude of I don't know, and the sort of surprise look on their face when they hear stuff, and they become, as I said, more information aware. And in that position, they are then sort of empowered to make decisions much more quickly about where the real problem areas are, what they should focus on first. And for me, I think it's moving culturally from the position of having no idea and almost burying your head in the sand about it, to being aware the scale of the problem, where you should start, and the things that you can do. And let's be honest, there are things that really aren't realistic or aren't achievable or are very rarely worthwhile in terms of the cost and the time they take, but what you can and can't do to improve matters. That's probably for me one of the biggest signs that an organization's really got benefit from this.
Yes, and I have to say that it's really important to look at what you are measuring and what you can measure in these exercises. So I remember working with a customer who was looking at return in terms of the speed it took to find information and for staff to access information. And that seemed at the beginning of the project to be quite a useful measure to have as to how quickly the system produced information. But in fact, what happened was that the improvement to search was such that people started using it who never used it before. They started doing very complex queries because they found that they could do them when they'd hadn't done complex queries before. And in the past, when they'd perhaps gone and looked at paper records and so forth, they started using the electronic system. So although the speed of search improved, actually the number of searches and the complexity of the searches acted in the opposite direction. So it's really important what you measure, because they really were getting value for that, except it wasn't necessarily showing in terms of the exact metric that they'd chosen to measure.
That's a really good point, and sometimes that may or may not be a good thing, and it's impossible to say now in all circumstances doing more searches or doing fewer searches is a good or a bad thing. You have to look at the bigger picture to try and really work out what that represents, what it means.
Absolutely, and so I've put a question mark on that slide after ROI, and I think really it's important to look at what you're measuring, but also to understand why you're measuring and what it's really indicating to you. And I think a spread of metrics rather than just a single metric is always going to be better for looking at how the behavior within an organization changes. So let's move on to our final question this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are in the world. And that is, what are the key lessons that we've learned? And I've put a couple of suggestions here around how long should the program take and who owns the information governance program. But there are lots of other types of questions that you could say lessons that we've learned. And so, James, I'm going to turn to you and ask you what the lessons you've learned are. And then perhaps after this, we'll look at this specific question that several people have now asked us in the chat around who owns the program and what is the multidisciplinary aspect of information governance about. But just before that, what are the key lessons that you have really got out of what we've learned from the past?
I feel a little sheepish in that I've already kind of played my hand when it comes to that. But to kind of synthesize the lessons that we've learned over, let's say, the past 5.5, 6 years, could be summarized thusly: that first of all, it's not a technology, but rather a people and process focused discipline. And that may be strange for someone who works for a technology vendor to say, and I'll admit it was not an easy lesson for us to learn, and we even resisted it a little bit, but the reality can't be avoided, in that if we're approaching information governance from a cultural and behavioral standpoint, then the answer to it has to also align with that and can't be a technology-driven one. And so our early project successes of, yay, we've connected all the systems, the project is complete, we've learned to not approach that, but instead approach it from, what do you actually do? So you're a user, a knowledge manager, you create content, you search for it, you access it. What does that actually mean? And then mapping out the project according to people's behaviors and the behaviors that you want in terms of managing and accessing and eventually destroying information. So that's the primary lesson, is that it's a behavioral rather than a technology focus. And then the secondary one, Tim made the point more clearly than I tried to, which is that the incremental approach of, once you've established what those behaviors are, and then implementing the project according to those, you're doing so in a very small way, and iterating success upon success upon success, and it can't be overstated the importance of this, trumpeting that to success, letting the organization know what you've done, why you've done it, and the benefits of having done so, and then mapping that to benefits outside of that original scope.
And Tim, anything to add to that around what you see as the key lessons that we've learned from our sort of the last few years' experience with information governance?
So I think the first thing that I would say is I see information governance being a supporting service which should be present in organisations and should be provided to the verticals within an organisation to help show them, wherever it is owned, and whether it's come from an IT function or a legal function, or that's really less important to me in some ways. So, and that's probably going to satisfy the answer of who exactly should own it. But the important thing is to notice that it's something that's horizontal, that it goes across, and it is a supporting service, much like IT or health and safety or many of these other sort of corporate horizontal things are. So that's the first thing. In terms of the actual nuts and bolts of implementing, how long it should take. Well, for me, it will be glib to say how long do you want to stay in business, but I think if you're going to do it and you want to do it properly, it's not something. We had a question a bit like this actually that relates to a program stopping, but it's not something that really should stop. Of course, it's something there will be large amounts of resources going into it in terms of time and effort and so on. But it's something that should be a continuum, should go along with the business, and you'd expect to see peaks and bursts of activity when, I don't know, for example, an organisation is facing, let's say, some new legislation, like EU GDPR is a big one that we're talking about right now. So then you may expect the activities ramp up. And so there'll be quiet periods, but it's not something that I would see there ever being a close date on. The other final thing, and again, to go back to when I was talking about this sort of 80-20 stuff is, people are tempted to take very much a top-down approach, and as Jim was describing, be very prescriptive. And to some people who like to plan and they like a sense of order, it seems to make a lot of sense to say, well, I will find all of my policies now and I'll set them in stone, and then I'm done. And then I'll go out and I'll find where all my information is and I'll classify it according to those policies. And it can turn out, and I've seen it turn out, that either 95% of the content that you've got falls under 3 policies and you've defined 120, and clearly you've got that wrong somewhere. So people kind of put the cart before the horse, as you say. Or we get other scenarios where perhaps as we're going through, we discover that the policies and how we've decided to classify information from a theoretical perspective is not something that we can do in the field, because there is no accurate way that we can determine whether a piece of information that we've got is a type of document A or a type of document B, because the definition is, it doesn't match with the reality of what we see. So in reality, what that would mean to a project is, the information owners, so normally people who work within a vertical department, will need to talk to the people providing this horizontal service, and then there will need to be some sort of working together through, a steering committee or some form of project structure, really that will depend on the organisation you're in. But in order to make sure this stuff, works properly, and it's simple, and we've seen it in so many other types of projects, and yet people never seem to sort of learn these basic lessons, and we're as guilty as anyone, I think. And you can end up, well, perhaps not reinventing the wheel, but certainly seeing, the same wheel spinning around many, many more times than it needs to, and that it just delays things, and it makes it harder to sort of realise these benefits against the amount of resources that are put into a project or a programme of work.
I think that's really, really important, and I really want to emphasise that as well. And if we look at this question of who owns information governance and where does it belong in the organisation, and what is the nature of it and what disciplines are involved, I think we've seen all sorts of different configurations of that. We've seen information governance as part of legal. We've seen information governance as coming under a CIO or even a CDO. We've seen information governance as part of IT or even as a business function. But to me, like Tim, it doesn't matter so much where we place the information governance role, to make sure that it goes across all of the different disciplines that use it. So ultimately, information is a service that is being provided to the business, and managing that information, controlling it, having good governance over it is essential to the success of our business. So it as much belongs to the business itself as it does to any given specialist function within the business. And in order to make sure that we do our information governance program properly, we do need representation on our steering committee or on our strategy planning board of all of the areas of the business that produce and consume information, and other policies that we might need to put in place. And some of those come because of laws and regulations, and other policies are there because it makes our business more effective to do things in a particular way. It increases our reuse of the information that we have, for example. So it's really important that we involve people in that discussion and that they come from all parts of the business. It's not so important where we actually put the ownership of information governance. But having said that, it is important that information governance has an owner, because unless there is somebody with tasked with the responsibility of moving it and driving it forward, then I think that's a really essential characteristic.
Yeah, one thing I was going to say, John, is that, and it sounds a bit like we're trying to dodge the question of who the owner should be. What I would say is that there's not a one-size-fits-all. However, I do think that some sizes fit certain organisations much better. And one of the things is, if you are in a heavily regulated industry, okay, perhaps you're in life sciences or in financial services, which are both heavily regulated, but both quite different in how they operate, you would certainly have maybe a different view on where the information governance program should really sit and the legal involvement than perhaps an organisations whose major concern was about perhaps runaway storage costs or inefficient use of large amounts of information. And similarly, if you're a company who has lots of IP, lots of patents and a lot of value represented there, again, really who should be doing this, who should be controlling it, who's best placed to actually run it, the view may be quite different. So there isn't a right answer, but I certainly think there are patterns, and that's something, if anyone had any sort of particular questions or wanted to discuss that further, that's something that we could certainly talk about.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that, Tim and James. And my one final question is, has this discussion improved or simplified our understanding of information governance? And I'll leave that to the everyone out there in the audience to determine that for themselves. But we've got 2 more webinars as well in this series to clarify that and to start to increase that understanding. We're going to do a couple of the questions that we've received along the way in a second. Just before we do that, I just wanted to say that, of course, we invite you to try our product either under a free trial or to get a demo of GlassIG if you're interested in the software and the solutions that we provide. So it's very easy to do that. You just go to our website once more. There's those buttons up the top, and you can request a demo by pressing on the demo button, or sign up for a free trial of the software simply by pressing on the trial button there. Another thing that is coming in the near future on the 15th of June is a crowd chat, a new form of social engagement, and we're hoping not just to involve people from within GlassIG, but people from the wider community, and we have some very special guests there, Alison North and Chris Walker, and perhaps a few other people there as well, who are going to participate in that with us as well. And we're very grateful to have that involvement across the whole of the industry. So that is all around navigating the information governance journey, and that's coming up on the 15th of June. So now let's turn to a couple of the questions. We've probably only got time for 1 or 2 questions, Tim, but you've been monitoring them, and perhaps you could say what has been coming up most frequently.
So there are 2 really good questions that I don't think we've touched on at all, that if we have got time, it would be good to cover. So if you can try and keep us honest on the time front, John, so we can cover this, that'd be good. The first one, what types of skills and/or training would aid in the successful implementation of an information governance program, given that the program can possibly be owned by very different parts of an organization? I think it's an excellent challenge as a question to some of the things that we've been saying. So
absolutely, and it's a really interesting question as well. Of course, if you look at some of the traditional disciplines within information governance, such as records management and archiving and things, there are courses that you can do at university level around some of those functions. But maybe that's not really what the question is about. It's about how can, often within organizations, it's about how can people who really have another job as well participate in the information governance program, and what are the sorts of skills and the experiences that they need to be good contributors to that. So, James, I'm going to ask you if you've got any thoughts around that particular question, and feel free to chime in with thoughts around what is it that people can do to skill themselves up to participate fully in information governance.
It's the answer is kind of a role specific, has role specific flavors. So for the most part, those who need the most in-depth understanding of it tend to be those who are already seeking it in places like IRMS and ARMA and AIM and such. But that's kind of a preaching to the choir type approach. What I'm most interested in is how can we get folks who have, to this point, only been tangentially part of the conversation. And here I'm talking about end users, and here I'm talking about IT. And then to a lesser extent, some of those cross-disciplinary C-level folks, privacy, compliance, risk, GRC, et cetera. So, and unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for those. And so that's why it ends up being very specific to our, to the project scope and the problem being solved. So what we tend to do is as a project kicks off, let's say it's at a telco and a telecommunications provider, and some of the key items to be governed are things created out in the field by people who couldn't possibly be expected to understand the hows and whys of laws and regulations and retention schedules and things like that. Not because they can't, just simply it's just not part of their job. Well, what we'll do with our stakeholders in those cases is craft a very specific, perhaps 1 hour session to be delivered remotely, not unlike this one, that introduces them to the concepts of governance and why it's important and why it matters and what it means for them. And so that obviously can't go too deep, but it need not. And so for those who do need to go more deeply, there are obviously resources. I put a mention of the paper that I talked about earlier, written by the IGI. The Information Governance Initiative provides many free resources and others a little less so. And of course, there are other industry-specific and trade group-specific means at AIM and ARMA and the IRMS, et cetera. So I apologize for the lack of specificity there, but in reality, the question takes so many faces depending on who needs the information that there's just no single good answer for it.
And Tim, it's true too, isn't it, that even within the more generic business functions, we need our local champions. We need our people embedded within individual teams who are going to be able to help people coming on board in those teams, tell them about the information governance program, perhaps give them an induction, and we need that reach out across the organization in order for a program to be successful.
Yeah, I think that's true. In an ideal world, for the end users, you wouldn't need any training at all. It would be transparent. They do their daily jobs exactly as they do now, and there'd be no additional load on them at all. So anything would happen magically in the background. The reality is that we're not quite there yet. So what I would say is that we need to show people why it's a good thing to do, why we're doing it, and how that can actually help them as well. And incentivize and make sure that people are recognised for doing this properly, as they are recognised doing other parts of their job well. And it doesn't have to be, financially. There's a whole range of ways that people can be told, yes, you're doing a good thing, or perhaps if you could improve that, it would really help the rest of us out. So those things I think are the way that I would try and tackle getting people kind of more fired up and feeling encouraged to actually be a part of doing information governance within their own jobs. For the people who have to really take a more advanced role and actually need to do some understanding, I think they are the ideal candidates to be, as you said, the business champions. And where that works really well is that however excited about information governance someone is, and the reality is probably not very, I think we'll recognise, often people are afraid to reach out and ask for much help. And yet, if there is someone who's working, on the same floor as them at the end of their desk that they know that they have a relationship with already, and they can just ask an informal question, and that person has got most of the answers that they would need, then I think in that case, and just for that support and that guidance function, that would probably work really well. So, minimise the actual training. Other than that, it's really more of an awareness and kind of change management thing. And hopefully, although things won't be completely transparent to end users, I'd like to think at least that the process will be simple enough and intuitive enough and clear enough that once you explain to people that something is happening, something is changing, that these people are smart enough to be able to cope with minimal support from, as you say, their locally appointed champion.
Thanks very much, Tim, and thanks very much, James. And we're coming up to the end of our hour, so I apologise to those where we haven't got to your questions, but we will address them in the next webinar. We'll make sure that all of the things that have been, issues that have been raised, we will come back to and address as we go forward with this webinar series. So this was the first episode, and we were really looking at the retrospective view. And in the next episode of this webinar series, we're going to be looking at the present, the daily reality, what's actually happening within organizations. Who are these new information professionals who are emerging? Are they different to the traditional records managers? Are there new things that are happening there? And what are the main trends that are occurring within the workplace of information governance today? And so we will pick up on any of the questions that were asked that we haven't answered in that particular webinar. Remember the crowd chat as well. We'd love to have you involved with that, especially if you're involved in social media, because that's going to be pretty exciting. And we look forward to the next webinar. Thank you very much to James Ansler and Tim Snell, my guests here today. And from us, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.